Welcome to Copenhagen Chronicles, a podcast in English about the Danish tales of the past. You unfold your umbrella as you stroll through the damp streets of Copenhagen. As you walk along the canals, you pass by several buildings, churches and houses. Some have been around for hundreds of years, some are still under construction. Your gaze stops at the very top of the mighty tower of Christiansborg Palace, and you think to yourself, where did all of this come from? Of course, answering this question is not so easy. After all, Copenhagen has many years behind it and has gone through wars, fires, liberations, epidemics, pandemics, and revolution. No. To answer this question, we must first go back. Back before Christiansborg and the canals. Back before the towers, churches, and shiny glass buildings. We must learn who the earliest Copenhageners were and who helped the city into existence. Today, we look at how Copenhagen came to be. The oldest sign of human activity in Copenhagen is an altered reindeer antler, dated to be from between 12,500 BC to 11,500 BC, found at Bispingen. Since then, several items like dog bones, harpoons, flint tools, and axes have been unearthed and told the story of Copenhageners, or at least people living where Copenhagen currently is, and their way of living. Many of the stories we have about these early humans are based on pure guesswork from items, settlements, and burial mounds we've found. But one thing is for certain. They were hunter-gatherers. Reindeer hunter-gatherers that came from Central Europe following the reindeer's migration from the increasingly warmer south to the more temperate north. As the north grew warmer, it became more livable and had greater amounts of food on both sea and land. And in 8000 BC, many of these hunters built settlements, which has later been found in Copenhagen and Amager. By the time of the Stone Age, most Danes and Copenhageners learned to grow the land and even keep animals to further increase production. Houses were built, weapons were refined, pots and trays of clay were formed. For they had raw material unlike any other place in the world, quality flint and amber. It would not be an uncommon sight to see early Copenhageners, especially women, adorned with rows of glowing amber on their clothes. This all paved way for the Iron Age, and later the Viking Age, which I will be making at least a couple of episodes about a little bit later, where it was believed that Copenhagen was a bunch of small settlements instead of an actual connected town. Although signs of a bigger town have been excavated, like docks at Gammel Strand. These docks were actually found during the construction of the new metro station at Gammel Strand. It's kind of funny how building new things for the future can sometimes reveal things about the past. The earliest documented part of today's Copenhagen comes from a document from 1085, a deed gift from King Canute the Holy, whom I will also make an episode about later, mentioning among other Copenhagen places Sundby Vester. And King Canute, amongst other kings and powerful figures, are exactly what we're going to talk about now. For without what I'm going to tell you about next, Copenhagen as it is today would not have existed. First of all, we have to take a closer look at who Bishop Absalon was. Even if you don't know who he is, if you've been to Copenhagen, you've probably noticed the statue of him right next to Christiansborg, looking a bit more like a warrior than a bishop. Almost all of the information we have about Absalon's early life and childhood is based on speculation, and on findings in the area he was born. We know very few things for a fact, but what we do know is that Absalon was born close to 1128 on a farm in the village Fjenneslev Lille, today known as Kirke Fjenneslev, that lies between Sorø and Ringsted, and his parents' names were Asser and Inge. The story goes that when Inge was pregnant with Absalon, Asser went to war, but before he went, he told Inge to build a tower on the local church if she birthed a boy. If it was a girl, he should just let it stay as it was. When Asser came home from war, he saw not one but 2 towers on the church, indicating that Inger had given birth to 2 sons. As great as the story is, it's completely false, as Absalon's brother, Esbon, was Absalon's older brother and not his twin brother, and the bricks used to build the towers were only taken into use much later. We can only speculate as to how Absalon's childhood was, as nothing is written about this time of his life, and the only thing left of his childhood farm is a cellar. But with high probability, it can be said that Absalon grew up in a large farm with a fairly well-off family, where he learned what could be expected of a young boy from a family of his caliber. Most likely, he would have learned the basics of life and survival, like agriculture, how to work a plow, how to raise animals, how to grow crops. Since his home was surrounded by forestation, he would have learned how to hunt and gather food in the wilderness, and most likely also how to use a weapon to some degree. When Absalon hit school age, he got an education, which was quite rare at the time. Not only was education rare, but only few Danes knew how to read or write. First of all, there were very few things to read, as even the Bible was only distributed amongst the people of the church. And second of all, it wasn't really a necessity to read. A vast majority were happy to just attend church and listen to prayers and sermons, although these were in Latin, and they most likely understood very little to none of it. Absalon was even lucky enough to study abroad, which he did in Paris, a city that had become increasingly popular for the youth of all of Europe. Male youth, that is, of course. Here he studied geometry, philosophy, music, and the words of the Bible in the only language in which it could be read, Latin. After returning from Paris and taking part in the civil war between potential kings in Denmark, which I unfortunately do not have time to dive deeper into today, Absalon became bishop of Sjælland. He also became the current king, Valdemar's, right hand, as he helped him during the civil war. But instead of doing what bishops would probably be doing, like taking care of local churches, inaugurating cemeteries, and confirming children, he was much more focused on protecting Denmark and Sjælland from the Wends, a people inhabiting what today is northeast Germany, who Denmark had been at war with for years. Maybe this is why that before-mentioned statue have him depicted with an axe in hand instead of a Bible. Anyway, in 1178, Absalon became the archbishop and thereby the most important and influential person of the church, and he also built a fortress and a city wall in what is now known as Copenhagen. This area was gifted to him by King Valdemar, and was nothing but a small town on a hill between what we now know as Gammeltorv and Rådhuspladsen, or the city square. Most of the area was a bit of a marsh, and people had to build dams to not get wet feet. But Absalon's and the church takeover undoubtedly helped Copenhagen grow and prosper. And within his reign, the city gained Gråbrødre Church, Vor Frue Church, and St. Petri Church. This city also grew due to its otherworldly amount of herring from the nearby seas. Fishing has always been an important source of sustenance and trade resource, but herring was especially abundant, and was sold in large quantities to the rest of Europe. Especially Germans, with their vast amount of salt they used to preserve the fish, were frequent buyers. Not only was herring an easy resource to get a hold of, but it was also crucial for the Catholic Church-dominated Europe, who fasted almost half of the year. This meant they could not eat meat during the fast except for fish, making it an extremely popular source of much-needed protein and fat. One could kind of say that Copenhagen was built on and grew prosperous from herring. This despite being attacked several times by the Hanseatic League, pirates, and yes, by the Danish king himself. I guess that last part may take a bit of explanation before we continue. By the time of Absalon, the church and the crown were two separate powers. Ever since Harald Bluetooth, the Viking king that christened the Danes, the state and the church worked together to form Danish society. And for many years this relationship was mutual. The state provided the church with, well, churches all around the country and land, and turned the church into a force to be reckoned with. The church in turn provided the state with gudsfred, or pax Dei in Latin. Basically a church law preventing people from committing crimes such as attacking innocents, buildings, crops, and animals. But this relationship turned sour as the church gained more power and the throne was not exactly pleased with being undermined. After Absalon's death, he gave Copenhagen to Roskilde Episcopal See, but in 1259, King Christopher I wanted it back. The bishop at the time, Peder Bundgaard, asked for backup from the Germans who aided in the battle. Alas, Copenhagen was attacked and burnt to the ground. It was only in 1343 Copenhagen finally was taken over by the state. But Copenhagen was still not the most powerful city, nor was it the capital of Denmark, and this wouldn't change until much later in history. The first time Copenhagen could officially be called the Danish capital was in 1417, where King Erik VII, or Erik of Pomerania, King of Denmark, Norway and Sweden, moved the government to Copenhagen and made it the most important city for especially trade. And yes, you did hear that right, there was one king for 3 countries. At this point in time, the Kræmmer Union was in effect. This union joined Denmark, Norway and Sweden under a single monarch, even though the countries legally remained sovereign states. But anyway. Of course, Copenhagen was a much different city back then than it is today, both geographically and anthropologically. Unfortunately, no material depicting what Copenhagen actually looked like currently exists until the 1500s. So what is known about the city is based purely on archaeological findings. Compared to its now, as of 2023, around 600,000 inhabitants, only a mere 5,000 people lived within the city bounds. And there are also clear signs many people living in Copenhagen were German. In the late 1300s, 25% of all last names were German. A great wall and moat surrounded the entire city, leaving 3 ports, Østerport, Vesterport and Nørreport, as the only gateways in and out. This acted as a defense against attackers, and as Copenhagen prospered, there were more and more of that kind. Living in Copenhagen at that time might also have been even noisier than it is today. Walking through the city, one would hear the smith's hammer against metal, children playing on the streets and courtyards, people gossiping and salesmen and vendors yelling in the marketplace, the sound of distressed cattle as they were being dragged off to the butchers. Yes, next time you feel like the streets can be pretty noisy in Copenhagen, I want you to remember that you might actually be lucky compared to the inhabitants of medieval Copenhagen. And you should also feel pretty lucky that Copenhagen doesn't smell the same as it did. Most Copenhageners grew produce in their gardens and were somewhat self-sufficient, with the occasional supplementation from whatever they could buy on market days. This also meant that livestock was a common sight, both outside and within homes. And of course, all this food needed a place to go once digested. Copenhagen did not have any kind of sewage system, so you would either throw it out the window, use latrines, which were basically holes in the ground lined with clay or wood, or just do your thing in local harbors or lakes, which was of course also where the citizens' drinking water would come from. Nice. Several places in Copenhagen are actually named after this less than ideal way of getting rid of human waste. One of them is Magstræde, which literally means toilet, and Hyskenstræde, which comes from the word Hauschen in German, meaning the little house, aka toilet. In 2021, archaeologists found 18 latrines from the 1500s in København 44, 46 and 50, where they surprisingly found cat bones deep within the cesspit. While this could have been an unlucky cat that slipped and fell, it is also likely to have been a purposeful death, since bodies of dead animals were used to break down fecal matter. People in Copenhagen also looked much different than they do today. While very little is known about the type of clothing medieval Copenhageners wore, we know much more about what they wore on their feet. Leather shoes were a must and was worn by both men and women. In fact, leather was such an abundance that many threw away their shoes when they were too worn instead of just repairing them. It is believed that a pair would only last a couple of months before one would have to find a new one. Okay, so we learned about Absalon, how Copenhagen became the capital, and what life was like in Copenhagen when it turned from muddy hill town to major trade city. But where do you go in Copenhagen if you want to experience this crucial time in Danish history firsthand? One place you could go, which is a popular spot for many Copenhageners, is a walk around the lakes. More specifically St. George's Lake, Pevlinge Lake and Sortedam Lake. Not only did these three lakes exist in the Middle Ages, they also served important purposes. The water was used for the city's watermills, the water in Pevlinge Lake was used as water for the moats, and all three lakes were used for fishing. And of course, as you could maybe already guess, the lakes were also used for waste of the humankind. So next time you walk around the lakes in a warm summer's day, be grateful you do it now and not in the time of our ancestors. When it comes to buildings, countless of attacks, wars and fires have nearly eradicated what is left of buildings from the early Middle Ages. But we do still have some medieval buildings that stand today. The restaurant Kong Hans on Vingård Street is from the 1400s. And now you have to go downstairs to the basement to truly enjoy its beautiful interiors. The house was not always at basement level though. And this is not because it sank with time, but simply because the street surrounding it has grown upwards. But if you do not like to pay a hefty amount of money to dine in one of the oldest houses in Copenhagen, how about a free trip to a church? St. Petri Church, right next to Magasin, still has elements of the main building from the 1400s and an extensive and impressive collection of, well, human remains of important and famous Danes, and a beautiful interior to boot. And on the way there, why not take a stroll down before-mentioned Magstræde, or Toilet Street? Despite its name, the street is incredibly charming and colorful, and still lined with its original cobblestone. This street is also one of the few streets in Copenhagen that were almost untouched by the many fires, and truly acts as almost a time capsule, giving you a glimpse of exactly how close everyone actually lived to each other. No wonder the city kept burning down. Now you know a little more about Copenhagen and why it came to be. Perhaps this makes your time in the city a bit more enjoyable, or a bit more interesting. If nothing else, next time you hear a Dane talk about pickled herring or see it on the table at Christmas or Easter, you may know why.